The relationship between the Old and New Testaments can be seen through several key characteristics: the Old Testament as a foreshadowing, the New Testament as fulfillment. Old Testament. The Old Testament contains many types and symbols that foreshadow future redemption. The law, sacrifices, temple, and priests in the Old Testament all point toward Jesus Christ and his work of salvation. For example, the Passover in the Old Testament foreshadowed Jesus as the Lamb who would be sacrificed for the sins of the world. New Testament. The New Testament is the fulfillment of these types and symbols. Jesus Christ is the realization of all the foreshadowed events in the Old Testament. He fulfills the requirements of the law and brings complete salvation through his death and resurrection for all believers. Transition from law to grace. Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the law was a set of guidelines given to the nation of Israel, dictating their behavior and relationship with God. Through the law, God revealed his holiness and justice, showing humanity the seriousness of sin and the inability of humans to keep the law on their own. New Testament. The New Testament, centered on Jesus Christ, emphasizes grace over law. Jesus not only fulfilled the law's requirements but also brought salvation to believers through his sacrifice. Salvation is no longer based on works, but on faith, through which believers receive God's grace. God's promises and their fulfillment. Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God made many promises to the people of Israel and to all those who trust in him. These promises include God's covenant with Abraham, the restoration of Israel, and the coming of the Messiah. Some of these promises began to be fulfilled in the Old Testament, but their ultimate fulfillment is seen in the New Testament. New Testament. Jesus Christ in the New Testament is the fulfillment of God's promises. As the Messiah, his coming not only fulfills Israel's plan of salvation but extends to all Gentiles who believe in him. Through Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, God's promises were finally and fully accomplished. Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God's plan of salvation was mainly carried out through the nation of Israel. God chose Israel as his people, and guided them to a close relationship with him, through the law, prophets, and sacrifices. While God revealed himself to other nations, Israel was his chosen witness. New Testament. In the New Testament, salvation is extended to all nations, no longer limited to the Israelites. The work of Jesus Christ was not just for Israel but for the redemption of the whole world. Through Jesus, all who believe in him can be saved and become children of God. The balance of God's justice and mercy. Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God often reveals his justice and holiness, especially in the judgment of sin. However, God also reveals his mercy, such as his forgiveness of the repentant Israelites, and the sacrificial system he provided for atonement. New Testament. In the New Testament, God's justice and mercy are perfectly balanced through Jesus Christ. Jesus became the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world, demonstrating God's justice against sin while also displaying his mercy and grace toward believers. Through such sacrifice, God's justice is satisfied, and his mercy is made evident. The relationship between the Old and New Testaments is deep and multifaceted. From types to fulfillment, from law to grace, from promises to their fulfillment, and from particular to universal. The Old Testament lays the foundation for the New Testament, which is its realization. The New Testament is not only a response and fulfillment of Old Testament promises, but also a comprehensive unfolding of God's plan of salvation, extended to all humanity, demonstrating the perfect balance of God's justice and mercy.